Our February the 15th lesson, again, grows out of the book of Nehemiah. And we're going to look particularly at chapter 9 and see something of the spiritual revival that happened following the rebuilding of the walls and the reading of the law of God. And I thought about a time in American history where there was this great spiritual awakening. It was in the 1720s to 1740s, and historians refer to it as the Great Awakening. One of the key figures in this was a man named Jonathan Edwards. He was born in Connecticut, but really grew to fame as a pastor in Northampton, Massachusetts. He went there to be the assistant to his grandfather, Samuel Stoddard, and then Solomon Stoddard, and then when his grandfather died, he became the pastor of that church in 1729. And he was concerned about the spiritual life within the church, and he began to preach sermons and began to have Bible studies and began to work with the people that created what eventually came to be known as the Great Awakening. It reached its peak in the 1740s, and George Whitefield came over from England to be a part of it. So that's one of the times of great spiritual awakening in American history. And it parallels to some degree the spiritual awakening that we see following the reconstruction of the wall and the reading of the law. What we see in our text for today in chapter 9 is 4 different manifestations of that spiritual outbreak that follows the rebuilding of the wall and the reading of the Word of God. The first manifestation we see in verse 2. Chapter 9, verse 2. It says that the Israelites gathered together, fasting and wearing sackcloths and having dust on their heads, and those of the Israelite descent had separated themselves from all of the foreigners. They stood in their places and confessed their sins and the wickedness of their fathers. So the first response, spiritual response, is for them to look inward and recognize, as Isaiah did when he went before the temple, "Woe is me, for I am an unclean man, and I am coming into the presence of a holy God." The manifestation of that was the wearing of the sackcloth and the mourning, which were signs of their recognition of their own sinfulness. As they listen to the reading of the law of God, they recognize that one of the things they had not done, that God's law instructed them to do, was to separate from all of the other peoples around them who were compromising their faith in the covenant God. And that's why it says here, they stood in their places, verse 2, they separated themselves from all of the foreigners. So confession of their sin, of not being separate, now leads to specific action in separating themselves from the people who are around them. So the first response to the reading of the law is for them to look in and say, look, we have not been doing what we were supposed to do. And that is to separate ourselves from the others so that we can concentrate our full attention on God. And now, in the aftermath of the rebuilding of the walls and the reading of the Word of God, we see that confession leads to that separation from those who are around them. That's the first response of this spiritual awakening. The second manifestation we see in verses 5 through 6, I use the word adoration. This confession before God morphs into adoration of God, as the Levites in verse number 5 say, and the Levites say, "Stand up and